In 1885, a woman's worth was measured by two things: her family name and her ability to produce an heir. For Jessie Mayfair, both were worthless. A childhood fever had left her barren, a whispered disgrace in the dust-choked society of St. Joseph, Missouri. She was a beautiful, empty vessel in a world that only cared about legacy. So when the most powerful woman in town, the venomous Beatrix Carmichael, arranged a marriage for her, it wasn't an act of charity. It was a joke of exquisite cruelty, designed to shatter what little of Jessie was left. She was being sent to the Wyoming wilderness, a mail-order bride for a reclusive cowboy whose only desire was a family to fill the vast, lonely plains. They would send the barren woman to the man who wanted nothing but children. They all waited for her to come crawling back, broken and shamed for a second time. They never imagined she would return. And they certainly never imagined she would come back with a child in her arms and a story that would burn their entire world to the ground. The whispers had followed Jessie since she was 16. They were the real bars of her gilded cage. After a fever nearly took her life, the town doctor, a man whose hands smelled of regret and cheap whiskey, had declared her womb a scorched garden. From that moment, she was no longer Jessie. She was the barren Mayfair girl. Her father, a merchant drowning in debt, saw her as an unsellable commodity. Suitors who once admired her wit now offered only their pity before turning to more fruitful prospects. At 24, she was an old maid, destined to fade into the background as a spinster aunt. The architect of this public humiliation was Beatrix Carmichael. Her face was a powdered mask of pleasantry, but her heart was a cold, hard stone. She ruled St. Joseph society with an iron fist, and her son, Beau, was its golden prince, handsome, charming, and utterly hollow. 2 years earlier, Beau had tried to court Jessie, assuming she would swoon like all the others. She had politely, but firmly turned him down. She found him shallow, and worse, cruel. The rejection festered in Beatrice's soul. An insult to her son was an insult to her dynasty. She couldn't ruin Jessie's reputation, the whispers had already done that. But she could orchestrate a humiliation so profound, so complete, it would be spoken of for generations. The weapon for her revenge arrived in the form of a letter. A business associate who ran a mail-order bride agency passed it along. A man in Wyoming territory, a Mr. Wyatt Smith, was looking for a wife. The letter was short and blunt, filled with a stark, aching loneliness. He owned a ranch, he was solvent, and he wanted a sturdy partner to build a family. A cruel, brilliant idea sparked in Beatrice's mind. She would sponsor Jessie. She would give her a way out. She summoned Jessie and her father to the Carmichael mansion, a monstrous house that loomed over the town like a vulture, ready to pick the bones of its next victim. "My dear Jessie," Beatrix began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "it pains me to see a woman of your refinement with such limited prospects." Jessie's spine stiffened. This was no kindness. This was a performance. Beatrix gestured to the letter on her mahogany desk. "I have arranged a match. A rancher in Wyoming, a Mr. Smith. He is a man of property, seeking a wife to bear his children." She let the last words hang in the air, heavy and sharp as daggers. Jessie's father, seeing only an escape from his daughter's financial burden, began to stammer his gratitude. But Jessie saw the triumphant glint in Beatrice's eyes. This wasn't a marriage. It was a spectacle. They would pay her passage. They would buy her a new dress. They would make a grand show of their charity, sending the barren woman to the lonely cowboy who desperately wanted a family. Then they would wait. They would wait for the inevitable, humiliating return. They would wait for the cowboy to discover the truth and send her packing, a twice-shamed woman with nowhere left to go. The joke was layered and vicious. Not only would Jessie be rejected, but the poor, unsuspecting cowboy would be a pawn in their cruel game. He too would be humiliated. That was the master stroke of Beatrix's plan. That night Jessie lay awake, the weight of her life pressing down on her. She could stay in St. Joseph and wither under the constant rain of pity, or she could walk directly into the trap Beatrix had set. The West was a place of hardship and death, she knew, but it was also a place of reinvention. Out there, under a sky bigger than she could possibly imagine, maybe she wouldn't be the barren Mayfair girl. She would just be a woman. A flicker of defiance, a feeling she thought had died long ago, ignited inside her. She would go. She would face this unknown man and this desolate land. She would survive, and by surviving, she would rob Beatrix Carmichael of her victory. She packed a single trunk, a few practical dresses, her mother's Bible, a worn book of poetry. As she boarded the train, she saw them. Beatrix and Beau Carmichael, watching from their carriage, their faces smug with triumph. They smiled and waved, the perfect picture of benevolent patrons. Jessie didn't wave back. She simply met Beatrice's gaze, her own expression a blank mask. Then she turned her face toward the setting sun, toward the vast, terrifying, and promising emptiness of the West. The cage door was open, and she was flying straight into the heart of the storm. The journey west was an assault. The clatter of the train wheels became the heartbeat of her new life, each mile pulling her further from the suffocating civility of St. Joseph. The lush greens of Missouri bled into the sun-scorched plains of Nebraska, and finally into the stark, majestic landscapes of Wyoming. The world grew larger, and she felt herself shrinking, a tiny speck in a land governed by wind and stone. From the train, she took a bone-rattling stagecoach to an outpost called Jericho Creek. It wasn't a town so much as a suggestion of one. A single muddy street with a general store, a saloon, and a handful of weathered houses. This was where she was to meet Wyatt Smith. She stood on the wooden porch of the general store, her trunk at her feet, feeling the stares of the few people who passed. These weren't the people of St. Joseph. Their faces were carved by sun and wind, their eyes holding a weary pragmatism. Here, a person's worth wasn't in their lineage, but in the calluses on their hands. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, a man on a dusty bay horse rode into town. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. His face looked as if it were carved from the Wyoming landscape itself. Strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of faded denim that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't handsome like Beau Carmichael. He was formidable. He approached her, his steps slow and measured. "Miss Mayfair?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Mr. Smith," she replied, her own voice steady. He just nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her city dress, her pale face, her soft hands. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet assessment. He loaded her trunk onto a pack mule, helped her onto his horse, and then mounted behind her. The intimacy of it was startling. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, his arm a steady presence around her waist. They rode out of Jericho Creek in silence. The silence wasn't awkward. It was vast and natural, the true sound of the plains. He seemed perfectly at home in it. After 2 hours, they crested a ridge, and he finally spoke, his voice close to her ear. "That's it. Solitude's End." The name was fitting. Nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek was a small, sturdy cabin. It was utterly isolated. A corral, a barn, and the cabin were the only signs of human life for as far as the eye could see. The cabin was rustic but clean, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A handmade table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room. A single bed frame was tucked into a partitioned-off area. He had built it all himself. It was a fortress against the wilderness. That first evening, the unspoken question hung between them, the reason he had sent for her, the expectation she could never fulfill. She decided she could not start a new life with a lie. As he cleared their simple meal of salt pork and beans, she took a deep breath. "Mr. Smith," she began, "there is something you must know, something the woman who sponsored me failed to mention." He turned from the wash basin, his expression unreadable. "Wyatt," he corrected her gently. "My name is Wyatt." "Wyatt," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "When I was a girl, I had a terrible fever. The doctor said, he said it left me unable to have children." She watched his face, braced for the anger, for the disappointment, for the cold dismissal. This was it. This was the moment the joke would land. This was when he would tell her to be ready for the next stagecoach back east. Wyatt stood there for a long moment, drying his hands on a rag. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and then he looked around the small, empty cabin. A flicker of something, resignation, maybe sadness, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The doctor said," he stated, his tone flat. "He didn't know for certain." "He was quite sure," she insisted, wanting the truth to be clear between them, however painful. Wyatt shrugged, a simple, powerful gesture. "This land is hard, Jesse. It takes more than it gives. A wife who can stand by my side, who isn't afraid of the silence and the work. That has a value all its own. We'll face what comes, or what doesn't." He turned and banked the fire for the night. "The bed is yours," he said, his back to her. "I'll take my bedroll by the hearth." And that was it. No explosion of rage, no cruel words, just a quiet, stoic acceptance that was more shocking than any anger could have been. Jesse stood in the middle of the cabin, the silence now filled with a strange, burgeoning hope. The cruelest joke ever devised had just been told in the vast, lonely wilderness of Wyoming, and its punchline had utterly failed to land. Life at Solitude's end was a rhythm of relentless work. In St. Joseph, Jesse's days were measured by social calls. Here, they were marked by the rising of bread, the mending of clothes, the tending of a small garden she carved out of the stubborn soil. It was hard work that left her muscles aching, but for the first time in her life, she felt useful. Her worth measured not by her womb, but by her resilience. Wyatt remained a man of few words, but Jesse began to learn his language. It was a language of action, not prose. Love wasn't in sonnets. It was in the bucket of fresh well water he silently left by the door each morning, so she wouldn't have to carry it. Respect wasn't in compliments. It was in the sturdy axe handle he carved to perfectly fit her grip. Concern wasn't in anxious questions. It was the extra blanket he'd leave on the foot of her bed when the nights grew colder. He taught her about the land, showing her which berries were safe to eat, how to read the clouds for a coming storm. He taught her to shoot a rifle, not for sport, but for survival. Her aim was steady and true, and the first time she brought down a rabbit for their stew, she saw a flicker of genuine pride in his eyes that warmed her more than any fire. In return, she brought a quiet softness to his harsh world. She planted wildflowers around the cabin, a defiant splash of color against the muted landscape. In the evenings, she read to him from her book of poetry, her voice filling the silence that had been his only companion for so long. At first he seemed indifferent, but she would often catch him watching her, his expression thoughtful. One evening, after she finished a verse, he spoke into the quiet. "My mother used to read like that," he said, his voice thick with a memory he'd never shared before. The wall of his solitude, built brick by brick over years of loss, was beginning to crumble. She learned his past in fragments. His parents had been killed in a raid when he was just a boy. He'd built this ranch on their land, carving a life from a place most would have abandoned. He had sent for a bride not just for heirs, but for companionship, to have another human voice in the vast emptiness. For months, they maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, a respectful distance. But the space between his bedroll on the floor and her bed in the alcove began to feel charged with an unspoken tension. The change came with the first autumn rains. A cold, miserable drizzle fell for 3 days straight, trapping them in the cabin. The space felt smaller than ever. On the third night, with the fire crackling and the rain drumming on the roof, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said. Jessie put down her mending and looked at him, truly looked at him, not as her husband by arrangement, but as the man who had shown her more kindness than anyone in her entire life. "Wyatt," she said softly. He looked up from the harness he was oiling, his blue eyes catching the firelight. She didn't know what she was going to say, but no words were needed. She rose from her chair, walked the few steps to his bedroll, and lay down beside him, pulling a corner of his blanket over her. He froze, his whole body rigid with surprise. He didn't move for an eternity. Then, slowly, tentatively, he turned to face her. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the dim, flickering light, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of deep, aching loneliness finally finding its solace. That night, for the first time, Wyatt Smith did not sleep on the floor. He slept in the bed with his wife. And in the quiet intimacy of their union, they were no longer just a man and a woman bound by paper. They were a family. The cruel joke from St. Joseph was a distant, faded memory. A ghost that had no power here. The first winter was a trial by ice. The sky turned a leaden gray, and the wind carried a bite that cut to the bone. Wyatt had prepared, chopping a mountain of firewood that stood taller than he was. He warned Jessie that a Wyoming blizzard wasn't just snow. It was a living monster that could swallow the world whole. In mid-January, the monster came. It started with an eerie stillness. Then hesitant flakes began to fall. Within an hour, it was a blinding horizontal torrent, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Wyatt had been out since dawn, checking on a section of his herd. He'd promised to be back by noon. But as the storm raged, noon came and went. Jessie stood by the window, peering into the swirling white chaos, her heart a cold knot of fear. She couldn't see more than 10 feet from the door. The world had been erased. By late afternoon, panic began to set in. She kept the fire roaring, a beacon against the tempest. The cabin groaned under the assault of the wind, and snow piled in deep drifts against the walls. As dusk fell, turning the white world into an inky blackness, she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it came again, faint and high-pitched. A sound that didn't belong, a human cry. She grabbed Wyatt's heavy buffalo coat, pulled on her boots, and tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end to the sturdy door handle. It was a fool's errand. To step outside was to risk being swallowed by the storm. But she couldn't ignore the sound. She opened the door, and the storm lunged at her, a physical blow of wind and ice that stole her breath. Plowing through snow already up to her knees, she followed the desperate, wavering cry. About 30 yards from the cabin, near a rocky outcrop, she found them. A woman, barely more than a girl, was slumped against the rock, her clothes frozen stiff. Her face was blue with cold, and bundled in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a baby. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were wide with terror and fierce maternal protectiveness. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile crackle. "My boy, Thomas." "We have to get you to the cabin," Jesse shouted over the wind. The woman shook her head, a small final gesture. "Too late for me." With impossible strength, she pushed the bundled infant towards Jesse. "Take him, please." Her hand went to a small silver locket around her neck, her frozen fingers fumbling with the clasp. Give this to him, so he knows." Her voice trailed off, her eyes losing focus. Her last breath was a white plume in the frigid air, and then she was still. Jesse stood frozen, the wailing wind and the wailing baby, the only sounds in the universe. She looked at the dead woman, a stranger, and then at the tiny red-faced infant in her arms. There was no time for grief. There was only survival. Clutching the baby to her chest, she used the rope as her guide, pulling herself hand over hand back towards the faint glow of the cabin window. Every step was a battle. Finally, her hand hit the solid wood of the door, and she stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor as the storm slammed the door shut behind her. She was soaked and half frozen, but her only thought was for the child. She unwrapped the bundle. A boy, no more than a few days old, his skin frighteningly cold. She stripped off his wet wrappings and her own sodden coat, wrapping him in a dry blanket and holding him close, trying to warm him with her own life force. She managed to get a few precious drops of warmed milk into him. Slowly, miraculously, his crying subsided. She had just settled him into a crate she'd lined with a soft shawl when the cabin door burst open again. It was Wyatt, covered in snow and ice, his face rimmed with frost, but alive. He slammed the door shut, his chest heaving. His exhausted eyes scanned the room, then fell on the makeshift cradle by the fire. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at Jessie, at her wet clothes and shocked face, and then back at the crate. He walked over slowly and looked down at the sleeping infant. He looked at the dead woman's silver locket, which Jessie had placed on the table. "Jessie," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "what is this?" Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. "There was a woman," she choked out, the story tumbling out between sobs. "In the storm, she gave him to me. She called him Thomas. She died, Wyatt. She died right out there." Wyatt didn't speak. He reached into the crate, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size, he lifted the sleeping baby into his arms. He held the infant against his chest, his large calloused hand completely cradling the baby's head. He looked down at the tiny perfect face, and in the hardened, lonely eyes of Wyatt Smith, Jessie saw a look of profound, heart-stopping wonder. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the world was silent and still. The blizzard imprisoned them for 2 more days. Outside, the world was a howling void. But inside the sturdy log walls, a new world was being born. The silence of their marriage was replaced by the demanding cries of an infant and the quiet, collaborative whispers of 2 people learning to be parents. Wyatt was transformed. The gruff, solitary man became a bastion of surprising tenderness. He would sit for hours by the fire, the baby, Thomas, sleeping soundly on his broad chest. He learned to change his swaddling, his movements growing more confident with each attempt. He watched Jessie as she fed the baby, a look of quiet awe on his face. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon, his voice filled with a reverence she'd never heard. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed. "I'm terrified I'll do something wrong." "You saved his life, Jessie," Wyatt said, his gaze unwavering. "You walked out into that storm. That's not doing something wrong. That's everything, right?" They became a team. When Thomas cried, they took turns walking him across the cabin floor, their weary steps a shared dance of parenthood. The cabin, once a symbol of Wyatt's solitude, was now filled with life, with purpose, with a love that had arrived as suddenly and powerfully as the blizzard itself. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn in crystalline white. Their first act was to bury the boy's mother. Wyatt built a simple coffin, and they laid her to rest on a small hill overlooking the creek. Standing over the grave, with Jesse holding Thomas, Wyatt spoke. "We don't know your name, ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. "But we thank you. We'll raise him right. He'll be a good man. You have my word." It was a vow, a promise made to the dead woman, to each other, and to the child who was now theirs. There was no question of what to do next. Thomas belonged with them. They examined the silver locket. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of the woman, young, beautiful, with sad, dark eyes. On the other side, where a man's portrait should have been, it was empty. There were no initials, no clues. It was a mystery. For now, it was enough that it was Thomas's only link to the mother who had given him life. News of the baby traveled fast. When Wyatt next rode into Jericho Creek for supplies, with Thomas bundled securely in a sling on his chest, it caused a sensation. "Where in God's name did you get a baby, Smith?" asked Hank, the owner of the general store. "Found him," Wyatt stated simply, his tone daring anyone to question it. "A gift from the blizzard." The story spread, growing more mythic with each telling. The townsfolk, a practical people, were captivated. They had all lost someone to the unforgiving wilderness. The idea of the land giving something back was a powerful one. They started calling Thomas the Storm Child. The women who had once pitied Jesse now approached her with respect, offering advice and hand-knitted clothes. Jesse the outcast had found her community. Wyatt registered the boy's birth with the circuit judge, listing the parents as Wyatt and Jesse Smith. The date of birth was an estimate. The place of birth was listed simply as Wind River Valley. He was their son, legally, officially, in every way that mattered. Their life settled into a new, richer rhythm. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a home, filled with the gurgles and cries of a child. Wyatt worked his land with a renewed vigor, a man building not just a ranch, but a legacy. One evening, as Jessie watched Wyatt carve a small wooden horse for Thomas, her heart swelled. This life, this man, this child, it was more than she had ever dared to dream of. She thought of Beatrix Carmichael and her pathetic, cruel joke. She had been sent to this wilderness to be broken. Instead, she had been found. She had been sent to a man who wanted a child she couldn't provide. And now, by a miracle of fate, they had a son. The punchline had been twisted into a blessing. 2 years passed. The silence of solitude's end was replaced by the joyful noise of a toddler. Thomas, or Tom as they called him, was a whirlwind of energy with Wyatt's sturdy build and his mother's dark, soulful eyes. Wyatt and Jesse's partnership had deepened into a quiet, unshakable love. The ghost of Jesse's past, the label barren, had faded completely. Here, she was simply a mother. One summer, they traveled to Jericho Creek for the annual Founders' Day celebration. As Wyatt negotiated with the blacksmith, Jesse took Tom to the general store for a piece of candy. The town was bustling with unfamiliar faces, traders and businessmen passing through. One such man stood by the counter, a portly fellow in a sweat-stained suit, complaining loudly about the local whiskey. His voice had a familiar nasal drawl that tugged at Jesse's memory. As she paid for Tom's candy, the boy reached up and tugged at the silver locket Jessie now wore around her own neck for safekeeping. The clasp came undone, and the locket fell open, revealing the miniature portrait. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice drawled from beside her. Jessie looked up. The man in the suit was staring at the locket, his eyes wide with shock. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Edgar Schmidt. Couldn't help but notice that locket. And the boy. My goodness, he has the Carmichael eyes." Jessie's blood ran cold. The name hit her like a physical blow. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her voice tight as she quickly closed the locket. "No, no mistake," Schmidt insisted, his eyes gleaming with greed. "I'm a business associate of Mr. Bo Carmichael from St. Joseph, Missouri. I'd know that locket anywhere. Belonged to a little servant girl who worked for them. Caused quite the scandal. Disappeared one night. And that boy, he's the spitting image of Bo's late grandfather." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Old Beatrix Carmichael has been turning over every stone looking for that girl and the babe. Seems the girl's grandmother left her a sizable inheritance. A trust that only passes to her bloodkin. Beatrix doesn't care about the child, you understand. But the money, well, that's a different story." Jessie felt faint. The dead woman in the snow, the sad eyes, the empty space in the locket. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas's mother had been fleeing from Bo Carmichael, the man who had fathered and then abandoned her child. "You are mistaken," she repeated, her voice shaking. She turned to leave, but Schmidt grabbed her arm. "Now hold on, ma'am. Finding this boy could be very profitable for the both of us. A wire to St. Joseph. Mrs. Carmichael would pay handsomely." At that moment, Wyatt walked into the store. He took in the scene in an instant. The terrified look on his wife's face, the strange man's hand on her arm. Wyatt's face, normally so calm, darkened into a thundercloud. He crossed the store in 3 long strides. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took Schmidt's wrist in his hand. "Take your hand off my wife," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Schmidt yelped in pain as Wyatt's grip tightened like bands of steel. "Easy now, friend. Just a misunderstanding." Wyatt squeezed harder, his eyes burning with cold fury. "There is no misunderstanding. You will leave this store. You will get on the next stagecoach heading east, and you will forget you ever saw me, my wife, or my son. Do you understand me?" Schmidt, his face pale with fear, nodded frantically. Wyatt released him, and the man scrambled out of the store. Wyatt turned to Jessie, his expression softening as he saw her distress. "What was that about?" Her voice was barely a whisper as she told him everything. The name, the inheritance, the truth. Thomas was not just the son of a nameless woman. He was the illegitimate son of Bo Carmichael. He was an heir, and a ghost from her past was now riding on the wind, carrying the news back east. Back to the one person in the world who would stop at nothing to ruin her. The cruel joke wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time, they were fighting for their son. 3 months later, they came. A fancy black carriage, looking utterly alien against the dusty backdrop of Jericho Creek, pulled up in front of the town's only hotel. Out stepped Beatrix Carmichael, draped in black silk. Behind her was her son Bo, looking older and softer. They were followed by a lawyer from St. Louis with a face like a clenched fist, and 2 hired men with guns on their hips and cruel empty eyes. The news reached Solitude's end before they did. Wyatt and Jessie had known this day was coming. Wyatt had rarely strayed far from the cabin, his rifle always close at hand. Beatrix was too clever for a direct confrontation. Instead, she sent the town sheriff with a court order. It was a document, signed by a territorial judge hundreds of miles away, granting Beatrix Carmichael temporary guardianship of one Thomas Carmichael, pending a formal hearing to establish paternity and rightful custody. The hearing was to be held in 2 days in the Jericho Creek Saloon. The town buzzed. The Carmichaels, with their money and their city lawyer, moved through the town with an air of absolute certainty. They spread their story. They were there to rescue their long-lost grandchild from the clutches of squatters. They painted Jessie as a barren, desperate woman who had stolen a child to fill her empty life. The night before the hearing, Jessie stood over Tom's small bed, watching his chest rise and fall. He was hers. Biology didn't make a mother. Love did. Wyatt came and stood beside her, his large hand resting on her shoulder. "We won't let them take him," he said, his voice a raw promise. "How can we fight them, Wyatt?" she whispered. "They have money, lawyers, a judge's order." "We have the truth," he answered simply. "And we're on our land. That counts for something here." The day of the hearing, the saloon was packed. The whole town had turned out. On one side sat the Carmichaels, their lawyer, and their hired guns. On the other sat Wyatt and Jessie, looking plain and rustic. They had no lawyer. They had only themselves. The circuit judge, a man named Patterson with a reputation for being firm but fair, called the court to order. The Carmichaels' lawyer, Mr. Finch, was smooth and condescending. He produced a sworn affidavit from the doctor in St. Joseph, reaffirming Jessie's infertility. He painted a picture of a grieving, noble family seeking to reclaim their blood. "This woman, Jessie Smith," Finch declared, pointing at her, "was known to be barren. Is it not a remarkable coincidence that a woman desperate for a child just happens to find one in a blizzard? A child who, it turns out, is the sole heir to a considerable fortune. This was not a rescue. It was an opportunistic kidnapping." The crowd murmured. The story was compelling. When it was Jessie's turn, she walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding. She did not address the judge. She addressed the people of Jericho Creek. "I am not a kidnapper," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am a mother." She turned to look directly at Beatrice. "The woman you see before you sent me to this territory as a joke, because a doctor declared me barren. She sent me to a good man who wanted a family, expecting me to be sent home in shame. Her joke failed." She looked at Wyatt, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "2 years ago, in the worst blizzard this valley has seen, I heard a cry. I tied a rope to my door and walked into that storm. I found a dying woman. With her last breath, she gave me her son. She gave me this." Jessie held up the silver locket. "Mr. Finch and Mrs. Carmichael would have you believe this is proof of their claim. And it is, but not in the way they think." She walked to the judge's table and opened it. "They speak of the portrait of Thomas's mother, but they neglect to mention the other side, the empty side where the portrait of a loving father should be." She turned and faced Beau Carmichael, who refused to meet her gaze. "Why is it empty, Mr. Carmichael? Is it because you gave this to a young woman you professed to love, but were too much of a coward to put your own picture in it? Is it because you seduced a servant in your mother's house, and when she told you she was with child, you cast her out?" Beau's face turned white. Beatrice shot to her feet. "Lies! Slander!" "It is not slander." Jessie's voice rose with righteous fury. "There is more." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped paper. "This was tucked into the baby's blanket. I have kept it safe all this time. It is a letter." She began to read. The letter was from Thomas's mother to her unborn child. It spoke of her love for a man who had promised her the world and then abandoned her. It spoke of his cruel mother who had threatened her and forced her to flee. It named Beau Carmichael. It described his cowardice and her heartbreak. It ended with a prayer that her child would grow up to be a better man than his father. A stunned silence fell over the saloon. Every eye was on the Carmichaels. Beau looked like he was about to be sick. Beatrice's mask of composure had shattered. Judge Patterson cleared his throat. "Mr. Carmichael," Is this letter a forgery?" Bo couldn't speak. He just stared at the floor. The judge slammed his gavel down. "This court recognizes the boy may be the biological issue of Mr. Carmichael. However, it is abundantly clear that Mr. Carmichael abandoned both the mother and the child. Mrs. Smith risked her life to save this boy. Mr. and Mrs. Smith have provided him a loving and stable home. To remove him from the only parents he has ever known would be an act of profound cruelty. Custody is granted fully and permanently to Wyatt and Jesse Smith. The matter of the boy's inheritance will be placed in a trust managed by this court until he comes of age. Now get out of my town." Beatrice let out a sound somewhere between a screech and a sob. Her grand scheme had not only failed, it had exploded in her face, exposing her family's rotten core for the world to see. Wyatt stood and walked to Jesse's side, placing a protective arm around her. The people of Jericho Creek, who had been watching in silence, erupted in cheers. The Carmichaels, disgraced and defeated, were forced to retreat through a crowd of hostile faces. As they climbed back into their fancy carriage, Beatrix looked out and met Jesse's eyes one last time. There was no victory in Jesse's gaze, only a quiet, steely strength. The barren bride had not just come back with a child. She had come back with a family, a community, and a victory so complete it had ground the powerful Carmichael dynasty to dust. As the carriage rattled away, disappearing in a cloud of Wyoming dust, Wyatt pulled his wife and son close. The reckoning was over. They had won. They were home. And so the story of Jesse and Wyatt Smith became a legend in the high plains of Wyoming, a testament to the idea that family is not merely a matter of blood, but of heart, of courage, and of showing up when it counts. They raised Tom to be a man of integrity, a man who knew his value was in his character, not his name or his inheritance. The cruel joke that was meant to be Jesse's undoing became the foundation of her greatest joy. Her tale serves as a powerful reminder that the harshest wildernesses can sometimes forge the strongest souls, and that a life of worth is not something you are given, but something you build with your own 2 hands under a wide and open sky. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of resilience and frontier justice. If you were moved by Jesse's journey, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a great story, and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the heart of the American West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure.